The deadly fashion when wearing green could kill you. In the 19th century, the most fashionable color in Europe could quite literally kill you. But the story begins centuries earlier in medieval times, when the quest for the perfect green dye became an obsession that would eventually poison thousands of people. And they wore it willingly even when they knew the danger. When you think of deadly fashion, you might imagine corsets that restricted breathing or high heels that damaged feet. But what if I told you there was a color, a beautiful, vibrant shade of green that killed the people who wore it, the workers who made it, and even those who simply lived in rooms decorated with it? What if that color was so desirable, so fashionable, so sought after, that people continued using it even after they knew it was lethal? This is the story of Scheele's green and Paris green, the toxic pigments that became the height of fashion and interior design, and how humanity's obsession with a single color left a trail of bodies across Europe. But to understand why this particular green was worth dying for, we must travel back to medieval times, when green was the most problematic color in the entire spectrum. The medieval green problem. In medieval Europe, most colors were relatively straightforward to produce. Red came from madder root or insects like cochineal. Blue came from woad or the more expensive indigo. Yellow came from saffron or various plants. Brown, black, gray, all easily obtained from natural sources. But green? Green was a nightmare. You might think green would be easy. After all, nature is full of green plants. Just crush some leaves, extract the chlorophyll, and you're done, right? Wrong. Chlorophyll is remarkably unstable as a dye. It fades quickly when exposed to light and air, breaking down into an ugly brownish yellow within weeks or even days. Medieval dyers who tried using plant-based greens found that their carefully dyed fabrics would turn muddy and dull almost immediately. The solution medieval dyers developed was clever but problematic. They would dye fabric first with yellow from weld or other plants, and then over-dye it with blue from woad. This two-step process called Saxon green or Lincoln green, yes, the same Lincoln green that Robin Hood supposedly wore, produced a reasonably stable green color. But it was expensive, requiring two separate dyeing processes. It was also inconsistent. The exact shade varied depending on the quality and proportions of the two dyes. And perhaps most importantly, the color wasn't particularly vibrant. Medieval greens tended toward olive or sage tones, muted and earthy rather than bright and eye-catching. This meant that in medieval color symbolism and sumptuary laws, regulations dictating who could wear what based on social class, green occupied an interesting space. It wasn't a peasant color. The two-step dyeing process made it too expensive, but it also wasn't a truly prestigious color like purple or scarlet. Green was the color of merchants, of the rising middle class, of people with some means but not true nobility. Green was also symbolically complex. It represented nature and fertility, but also jealousy and fickleness, hence our phrase, green with envy. It was the color associated with fairies and the supernatural in folklore, beings that could be helpful or dangerous, never quite trustworthy. Green was liminal, in between, neither here nor there. But most frustratingly for medieval people, green was impossible to make truly bright and permanent. The Renaissance obsession. As Europe moved into the Renaissance, the desire for better, brighter colors intensified. This was an era of artistic revolution, when painters were developing new techniques and wealthy patrons wanted art that dazzled. Bright, stable pigments became precious commodities. For green, painters had a few options, all problematic. Verdigris, made from copper exposed to acetic acid, essentially corroding copper in vinegar, verdigris produced a bright blue-green. But it was corrosive. It would literally eat through the canvas over time. Many Renaissance paintings have lost their green tones entirely as the verdigris destroyed itself and the surrounding paint. Green earth, a naturally occurring clay mineral that produced a muted olive green. Stable, yes. Exciting? Not remotely. Malachite. Ground from the semi-precious stone, malachite produced a beautiful green, but it was expensive and labor-intensive. Artists of the Renaissance desperately wanted a green that was bright, permanent, affordable, and safe to use. They got 3 out of 4. Enter copper arsenite, Scheele's green. In 1775, a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele developed a new green pigment that seemed to solve all the problems. By combining copper with arsenic trioxide in the presence of sodium carbonate, he created copper arsenite, a pigment that produced the most brilliant, vibrant green anyone had ever seen. Scheele's green, as it became known, was a revelation. It was bright, truly bright, an almost emerald hue that made all previous greens look dull by comparison. It was stable. Unlike plant-based greens, it didn't fade in light. It was relatively inexpensive to produce, and it could be used in everything: paint, fabric dye, wallpaper, artificial flowers, even food coloring. There was just one tiny problem. It was made from arsenic, one of the most toxic substances known to humanity. But surely, people reasoned, the arsenic was bound up in the chemical compound. It was stable. It wouldn't come loose. It was perfectly safe. They were catastrophically wrong. The Victorian green craze. By the 1800s, green had become the height of fashion. The Romantic movement celebrated nature, and what better way to bring nature into your home than through the color that symbolized it? The expanding middle class, newly wealthy from the Industrial Revolution, wanted to demonstrate their taste and prosperity. And green, bright, beautiful, fashionable green, was how you did it. In 1814, chemists developed an even better green pigment, copper acetoarsenite, which came to be known as Paris green or emerald green. It was even more vibrant than Scheele's green and had better color stability. It quickly became the most popular green pigment in Europe and America. Victorian homes were adorned with green in every possible form. Wallpaper in brilliant green patterns covered walls in parlors and bedrooms. Curtains in fashionable green velvet or silk hung in windows. Dresses in stunning shades of green became the must-have fashion item. Artificial flowers for decorating hats and gowns were dyed bright green book covers, and wrapping paper featured green printing. Children's toys were painted with green paint. Confections were colored with green dye to make them more appealing. A fashionable Victorian lady might wear a green dress with green artificial flowers in her hair, receive guests in a green parlor with green wallpaper and green curtains, serve them green-colored candies on a green-painted tray, and give them green-covered books as parting gifts. She was essentially wrapping herself and everyone around her in poison. How arsenic kills! Here's what made these green pigments so insidious. Under normal, dry conditions, they were relatively stable. The arsenic stayed bound in the chemical compound. But introduce moisture, humidity, sweat, rain, and things changed. When arsenical greens got damp, they began to release arsenic in various forms. Arsenic dust. The pigments would flake off from wallpaper, fabric, or painted surfaces, creating tiny particles that people inhaled. Arsen gas. Certain molds and bacteria that grew in damp conditions could metabolize the arsenic compounds, converting them into arsine gas, a highly toxic, garlic-scented vapor that was virtually undetectable at dangerous concentrations. Direct absorption. Arsenic could be absorbed through the skin from fabric or slowly ingested from contaminated hands. The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning are insidious: fatigue and weakness, digestive problems, skin lesions and discoloration, hair loss, numbness in extremities, confusion, and memory problems. Eventually, organ failure, cancer, death. Because the symptoms came on gradually and were nonspecific, people rarely connected their illness to their fashionable green surroundings. They blamed bad air, moral weakness, or mysterious constitutional problems. Anything but their beautiful green wallpaper. The body count, the death toll from arsenical greens will never be fully known, but historians have documented hundreds of specific cases and suspect thousands more went unrecognized. Factory workers, the people who manufactured green pigments, dyed green fabric, or printed green wallpaper, suffered horribly. They worked with concentrated arsenic compounds daily. Reports from the era describe workers with skin falling off their hands, breathing problems so severe they couldn't climb stairs, and death rates so high that some factories couldn't keep workers employed for more than a few months. One British factory worker named Matilda Scheele, who made artificial flowers, died at age 19 in 1861. Her autopsy revealed massive arsenic poisoning. Before she died, she vomited green water, her eyes became green, and witnesses reported that she was literally glowing green in her coffin. The arsenic in her body was so concentrated it affected her appearance even in death. Fashion victims. Women wearing green dresses suffered skin lesions, rashes, and systemic poisoning. The problem was worse when they danced. The combination of sweat and the friction of movement caused the dye to release arsenic that was absorbed through the skin. Several documented cases describe women falling seriously ill or dying after attending balls while wearing green gowns. Children. Victorian children's lives were surrounded by arsenic greens. Their nurseries had green wallpaper, their toys were painted green, their clothes featured green trim, and they played with green artificial flowers. Many childhood illnesses and deaths attributed to generic consumption or failure to thrive may have been chronic arsenic poisoning. Napoleon Bonaparte. This is one of history's greatest poisoning mysteries. Napoleon died in exile on the island of St. Helena in 1821. For decades, conspiracy theories suggested he was assassinated with arsenic. Analysis of his hair did show elevated arsenic levels. But here's the twist. His room at Longwood House was decorated with green wallpaper. In the damp, moldy conditions of St. Helena, that wallpaper would have been releasing arsine gas continuously. Napoleon's symptoms, fatigue, stomach problems, weakness, are consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning. He may have been slowly killed by his fashionable wallpaper, not by any assassin. The slow recognition. By the 1850s and 1860s, a few voices began raising concerns about arsenical greens. Dr. William Hines published research showing that green wallpaper released arsenic. Chemist August Wilhelm von Hofmann demonstrated that mold growing on arsenical dyes produced arsine gas. Doctors began documenting cases of illness connected to green fabrics and wallpapers. But the fashion industry pushed back hard. Green was profitable. The pigment manufacturers insisted their products were safe when used properly. Women's magazines ridiculed concerns as hysteria. After all, millions of people had green in their homes and were fine, or so they appeared. Chronic poisoning is easy to miss when you don't know what you're looking for. The debate became public and heated. In 1862, a British medical journal published an article titled "Arsenic in the Grave," describing how arsenic from clothing had preserved corpses in contaminated soil. The public was horrified, but not horrified enough to give up their fashionable greens. Manufacturers developed alternative green dyes that didn't contain arsenic, but they weren't as brilliant, as stable, or as cheap. Consumers could choose the safer but duller green, or the dangerous but beautiful arsenical green. Many chose beauty. Fashion's deadly vanity. This is where the story becomes truly dark. Even when people knew green could kill them, many continued wearing it anyway. Society's pressure to be fashionable was so intense, the desire to demonstrate taste and wealth so strong, that health warnings were ignored. Women's magazines published articles about the dangers of green dyes on one page while advertising green dresses on the next. Society ladies who prided themselves on being au courant would no more give up their green gowns than a modern person might give up their smartphone. The social cost seemed too high. There were even cases of women who knew they were being poisoned by their green clothing, but continued wearing it because fashion demanded it. One documented case describes a woman who developed severe rashes and lesions from her green evening dress, but kept wearing it to social events because everyone was wearing green that season. She eventually died from arsenic poisoning, having attended parties in the dress that was killing her till weeks before her death. This wasn't ignorance. This was vanity overriding survival instinct. The decline of deadly green arsenical greens finally began to disappear in the 1870s to 1890s, but not because of health concerns alone. Multiple factors contributed. Alternative dyes, the development of synthetic aniline dyes in the late 19th century, provided new green options that were cheaper and brighter than arsenical greens, with no toxic side effects. Regulation. Some countries began banning arsenic in certain applications, particularly in food coloring and children's products, though enforcement was spotty. Fashion changes. As fashion moved away from the bright greens of mid-century toward other colors and aesthetics, the demand for arsenical pigments decreased naturally. Public awareness. After decades of warnings, enough cases had been documented and publicized that even the most fashion-conscious began to reconsider. When several high-profile deaths were directly attributed to green dresses, the social acceptability of risking death for fashion began to wane. By 1900, arsenical greens were rare. By 1920, they had essentially disappeared from consumer products in developed countries. But the legacy remained, and remains still. The legacy of toxic fashion. The story of Deadly Green reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. Vanity can override survival. People will knowingly endanger themselves for fashion, status, and social acceptance. This isn't unique to Victorians. We still use products we know may be harmful because they make us look better or feel more confident. Profit delays regulation. The fashion and chemical industries fought safety regulations for decades, prioritizing profit over human life. This pattern repeats throughout history and continues today. Class and suffering. The poor and working class suffered most from arsenical greens. They made the pigments under the worst conditions, while the wealthy wore the finished products and could afford doctors to treat their symptoms, though ineffectively. Environmental and occupational hazards always hit the vulnerable hardest. Beauty standards kill. The definition of beautiful or fashionable is socially constructed, but the consequences are physically real. Victorian green dresses were no more inherently necessary than foot binding, corsets tight enough to damage organs, or any other fashion that damaged health. Yet people participated willingly, science and society. We had the scientific knowledge to identify the danger of arsenical greens decades before they disappeared from use. Knowledge isn't enough. Social change requires more than just facts. Medieval green to modern green. The story that began with medieval dyers struggling to create stable green ended with thousands dead from a perfect green that was too effective, too stable, too desirable. Today, we have countless shades of green available in every medium, all safe, all stable, all affordable. We've solved the problem that vexed medieval dyers and obsessed Victorian chemists. We can wear green, paint green, decorate with green without any risk. But we still haven't entirely learned the lesson. We still use products we suspect might be harmful because they're convenient or fashionable. We still prioritize appearance over health more often than we'd like to admit. We still allow industries to self-regulate when profits are at stake. We still see deaths from fashion. Maybe not from arsenic-laced dresses, but from the working conditions in fast fashion factories, from the environmental costs of textile production, from the psychological toll of impossible beauty standards. The color green itself is now associated with safety, nature, and environmental consciousness. A complete reversal from when it was literally the most toxic color you could surround yourself with. There's an irony there that the Victorians, dyeing in their beautiful green parlors, might have appreciated. The medieval quest for perfect green ended in a Victorian poison. Thousands died so that parlors could be fashionable and ladies could wear the season's most desirable color. They died for a social construct, for status, for beauty that existed only because society decided it did. And somewhere in that tragedy is a lesson we're still trying to learn, that what we call beautiful, fashionable, or desirable isn't always worth the price we pay. Sometimes the most attractive things are the most dangerous, and sometimes the hardest thing is to look at something society says is beautiful and say, no, not at that cost. The deadly greens are gone now, but the impulse that made people wear them, the willingness to sacrifice health for status, to ignore danger for fashion, to choose beauty over safety, that impulse remains as human as ever. At least now, our green dresses won't kill us. That's progress, even if the lesson behind it took thousands of deaths to learn.